Hello, everybody, and welcome to GCRE. Today, we're gonna be I'm happy to welcome you today to the GCRE TV show Mobile Home Park with Glenn. Today, we're going to be speaking about understanding park-owned homes, and when you should sell and when you should rent them out, or understanding all the finances and the expenses with it. So today, I would love to kind of learn a little bit more about this because this is something that I'm looking into personally. So let's wait no further, but to introduce Glenn. Glenn, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty great, man. I'm glad to be with you. Glad we're here.
Yes, so it's always a pleasure to be speaking with Glenn on this show. Glenn, as you guys know, is the mobile home park genius, as I call him. I would almost call him a wizard of the mobile home park world, and he's the guy that I always go to for any questions that I have. And in fact, he's so knowledgeable that his skills and his knowledge is transferable to many different aspects of life and business. So, Glenn, today we're going to talk about understanding park-owned homes, and all the numbers and the figures and when to sell and when to rent and stuff like that today.
Sure.
So it's a
Sure.
pleasure to have you today on the show. I would hand over the reels to you today, and off you go.
Great, great. It's great to be here. I like doing the show with you guys. I hope you guys are finding it useful and actionable. There's inside of our industry, we have a lot of different moving parts, and we've talked about a few of them on previous shows. But one of the more important parts that we haven't talked about yet is what is referred to as POH, park-owned homes, or the actual trailer that the tenant lives in, but the landowner owns the home and rents the trailer to the tenant. Whereas what most people want and what we typically look for in a deal, especially for new investors, is a land lease community, meaning there are no park-owned homes. The tenant living in the home owns the home that they live in, and they just pay a lot rent. Well, that's not always the case. In fact, it's often not the case. And in many, if not most parks, you're going to find at least one or two or a handful of park-owned homes. And sometimes, especially in the South where I live, you're going to find parks that are 100% park-owned homes. And there's benefits and disadvantages to either strategy or model that you decide to purchase. But if you find yourself in a park where you own park-owned homes, it could be lucrative or it could be a real slippery slope. And that's what we're going to talk to today about, is the park-owned home aspect of it. Now, to contrast one last time, a tenant-owned home, or TOH, is typically preferred. Okay, the rents are much lower, the maintenance and all the other stuff associated with operating the park is much lower, but it's not always the more profitable avenue. And there are some really distinct advantages to having a park-owned home. And moving forward, I'll probably be referring it to POH for the rest of this conversation. I'll probably bounce back and forth. But that's the vernacular between them, park-owned home and POH. So you're buying a deal, and despite the guidance from your broker or your advisors, you've decided to hone in on a park-owned home community. Typically, they're much harder to finance, through a bank with a park-owned home community. Most banks will let you get away with 10 or 20% of the rents coming from park-owned homes, but past that, it becomes really hard to finance. That's the first thing you should know about them. But let's just say you got it all lined up, or you're paying cash, the deal just makes total sense, and you're looking at the park-owned home income and trying to make sense of the pricing that you're looking at. So oftentimes, other brokers out there that don't specialize in manufactured housing don't really know how to underwrite these things when it comes to park-owned homes. So they just underwrite them like an apartment building. And that's often the first big glaring mistake that happens is, oh, we got, 100 units and they're all park-owned homes, or we got 10 units and they're all park-owned homes and the rents are $800 a unit. Well, you can't capitalize all of that $800 rent, okay? And if they don't have any lot renters or TOH in that park, it can be kind of hard to figure out what the basis is that you should be applying to your financial underwriting on what that park-owned home is worth, and what amount of income you should be capitalizing and not capitalizing. So I'm going to make it kind of as simplistic as I can. Understand there's always caveats to anything I'm saying, because just when you think you know something in this business, something changes or you learn something new. And I've been doing this a while, and I'm still learning new things every day about how this business really runs. And with park-owned homes, using the example of, let's say it's, make it easy, 10 units in a park, and the park-owned homes are all renting at $800, and you're like, oh, that's pretty easy. I can make, $8,000 a month in revenue, and I'll throw an expense ratio on there, and I should probably, use 30-40% or something like that, because that's what all the parks are selling at. And hey, this looks like great income, and it's a 10 or 12 cap or a 15 cap, I'm definitely going to buy it. Well, you miss so many things in doing that. First thing you need to know is a park-owned home community operates at a much higher expense ratio than a lot rent community. Most lot rent communities in most places, you can get down to between 30 and 40% operating expense. With park-owned home communities, it's often very hard to get below 40%, and more often than not, it operates at around 50-55% expense ratios. So you have to know that going into it. That said, you still don't want to run the math that way. So going back to $800 a month, and there's no other lot renters in that park for you to get an idea of what they are, of what the lot rents are for that market. Then you have to go out into that market and call a few of these other parks and get your best understanding of what that lot rent might be. Let's just say in this case, the lot rent for the local area is only $300, okay, which is a pretty typical number across most markets outside of primary cities. And $300 is not a lot of money to capitalize. So this, $1 million price the person might be wanting for his 10 lots, instantly becomes probably undoable. And you have to understand how that works. So you're going to take the $800, and of that $800, only $300 of that is being capitalized. And you're essentially taking that $500 and tossing it off to the side for now, okay? And that $500 per month per unit is not being capitalized, okay? So the $300, now you're really only using 300 times 10, right? So you got 3,000 times 12, whatever that comes out to be. And that is the gross revenues that you're going to be using. Keeping it down into a monthly form, we're just going to say $3,000. And so, if you did it by 12, it's $36,000. But we're used to $3,000 a month number. And from there, you then have to look at all the expenses that are being applied. Chances are, if they didn't separate out the income from the park-owned homes, they probably didn't separate out the expenses, and they probably just lumped them all together. And so your taxes are probably going to be very misleading. Your insurance is probably going to be very misleading. Your R&M, repairs and maintenance, is probably going to be very misleading. And you have to know how to segment that out. And the best way to go do that is calling up the city and or asking the seller and saying, hey, what is just the land tax on the park, and get that number, and then find out what is the personal property tax, which is your park-owned home tax and whatever other little personal property might be in there, but oftentimes the personal property tax is the park-owned home tax. And you're going to want to take that number. Now, if it's a new park-owned home, that tax might be very high. If it's an old park-owned home, it might be very low. So you have to take those numbers out from the taxes and just use the land portion of the tax and put it in there. Sometimes they merge all those numbers together, even at the tax office. It is very confusing. So you got to get somebody on the phone and have them walk you through the arithmetic on how they arrived at that, so you can back out what you need. Same with insurance. If a lot of these owners, they insure their park-owned homes for good reason, right? They might be a nice home, and if it goes down, you don't want to be totally out of pocket, and you're going to pay a much heftier premium on your insurance to insure those park-owned homes. Typically most markets, somewhere between $60 and $100 a year for your lot rent, for your dirt insurance, is your general liability insurance on just the park, on the dirt, not on the homes or the income, is typically a safe number to use. But on insuring those park-owned homes, it could be a couple $100. It could be considerably more. So you want to really kind of hone into that number and figure out how much of that insurance is related to the park-owned homes. Okay. Oftentimes the seller might not even know, and you're going to have to ask for his insurance report and figure out kind of what that breakdown is. And you still might not know, so you have to use your best guess. And the best guess that you want to allocate assuming you're not in a very high cost city or in a city with earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes, typically you're going to see your general liability to be between $60 and $90, $100 a year per lot. Okay, not per month, per year per lot. So you want to back that number into it. So now you've taken out the personal property from the taxes, you've taken out the personal property from the insurance, and then you got to keep working down the expense list until you've extracted all of those costs associated to it. Then you'll probably have something like a 30 or 40% expense ratio on the lot rent income that park is producing, even though it's all park-owned home. Kind of confusing, and I don't want to get you guys over your skis a little bit on this, but you need to understand this has to be extracted, or you are 100% going to overpay on your purchase, and it's going to make sense to you and all the people around you because they don't know what they don't know, and you're going to overpay on a park, and the seller is going to get a nice premium for selling it to you. So you got to really pay attention to this. Plus, the banks, they do know, and they're going to go back all that out anyways. And then you're going to say, oh, gosh, the bank's only willing to finance this thing for 50% of what you're talking about. And it's probably going to blow up your deal anyways. Or you're going to say, oh, no, I trust you and I'm going to pay you this money. And then you're going to overpay. So you want to really avoid that with park-owned homes. But here's the good news about park-owned homes. You finally get all that stuff extracted and you see that, hey, using the $300 lot rent basis, this thing is a 6 cap, not a 10 cap. Well, 6 cap is probably still a good number in the market you're looking at. Maybe not. Maybe it's a bad number, but in today's market, a 6 cap doesn't scare me at first glance, depending on where we are and other factors. So all that other income, remember that other income, that $500 a month that we just kind of tossed off to the side? Well, it's not like the seller is not going to get value for that income. There is value in that income, but you can't capitalize it. So what we have learned to do is apply a gross rent multiplier to it. It's also called a GRM. And so that $500 a month, that's worth $6,000 a year. Now, the maintenance on these homes, okay, is a lot, okay, like especially for the older models, pre-2000 type of models. You're going to spend a lot of that income, that $6,000, in maintaining that home, the stoves and refrigerators and floors and roofs and doors and all the stuff that's inside that home that is now your responsibility to repair for the tenant that you're supplying the home for. And you're going to be spending money because these guys are going to damage things. There's wear and tear, and it's on you to pay it. And in some states and some places, if you're not making the repairs, they might not necessarily have to pay you the rent on that they owe you monthly, and you might have to go through the courts and deal with some difficult issues there. So maintaining those homes is important, and that GRM that we're using, okay, is often a very low GRM, usually somewhere between a 1 and a 4 GRM. What does that mean, 1 and 4 GRM? So last year, the typical GRM on the deals that I did was about 2.5. Okay, so that $500, okay, that we're not capitalizing, is worth $6,000 a year. Okay, so that home, the maximum that home could be worth is $6,000 a year. So what we've learned to do is, like with a 2.5 GRM, you would take 6 times 2.5, which is like $15,000 for that home. That might be a really fair value for that home. That's going above the pricing of the capitalized lot rent income that we're using. Okay, so the park might only be worth $500,000 or whatever at a 6 cap. Okay, but the homes at $15,000 a home times 10, that's another $150,000 of value. So that $500,000 is really $650,000. And then that's kind of how you have to look at it. And remember, with park-owned homes, the average tenant is only going to stick around between 2 and 3 years in that home. Okay, and during those 2 or 3 years, if you vetted your tenants right, you're going to want to try and transfer that park-owned home to a tenant-owned home, because that's the real goal. And there's many strategies to do it, but the one thing you need to know if you buy park-owned homes and intend on selling them to the occupant or a future occupant, is you need to get your dealer's license, because in the cities, the municipalities, they will clamp down on you. The fines are expensive, and you open yourself up to some exposure there. So get your dealer's license. It's not expensive. It takes a few months, and that way you're all in compliance. Then you can start transitioning these homes pretty easily. Now, let's say you're buying a park that these homes that we just put $15,000 on is all 1970s and 80s homes, and they're in pretty rough shape, and the tenants are in and out less than a year most of the time. Well, you're not going to apply a 2.5 GRM to that income. Okay, you're going to apply a lower number, or you're just going to say, hey, I'm going to give you a blank shell value on that home because these things are, pretty much not really worth the rent they're producing, which oftentimes is the case. And in those kind of cases, so let's say you're in that market, and instead of the homes renting for $800 and the lot rents being $300, you might be able to make an argument, which this is what I did at my park anyways, and what I've helped advise on other parks, and what people do often with their kind of lower quality homes, the older homes, is since we're not capitalizing that income that it's producing, you kind of have like freedom to do what you want. You can almost be like, hey, this is what I did anyways. Hey, you're paying X amount of dollars a month for the home and the thing. If you want to own that home, I can give you this home for free. Okay, and free is a scary word. Trust me, I understand. But it's not really free, because what you're doing is in exchange of giving them that home, you're going to move every tenant in your park, in a park-owned home under the same type of condition, to a much higher than market lot rent. Okay, especially if you're a full park and it's 100% POH, this is a very easy thing to do. And move the lot rent, okay, to $400 or $500. Save your tenant a few $100s a month. Move your lot rent up considerably higher. Let the market catch up with you over the couple of years. And in 2 or 3 years, when we know that that's perfectly stable there and you're at a pretty high $500 lot rent, you'll be able to refinance on that $500 lot rent and be able to pull out a lot more equity, because now your basis in the park is considerably higher. You started at 300 and you moved it up to 500. The homes, you gave them away. Who cares? They're probably costing you more than they're earning you, because an average turnover is going to cost you $5,000 or $10,000 when a tenant moves out. You got to go fix it and do all the leaks and the floors and the roof and the this and the appliances and the that. And, it ends up almost always being a wash on actual income that you put in your pocket by the end of that, the tenant's term with you. So by giving a free home to a tenant who's probably already struggling paying the $800 a month, you earn some real loyalty. You provide good housing. They take over all of the responsibilities of that home, the maintenance, the leaks, the taxes, the insurance, all that kind of stuff. And it is now their responsibility. They are now a homeowner, and you're going to have a much more sticky tenant on your hands. He's going to probably stay there for a very long time after that. Of course, you got some agreements in place that prevent him from moving the home until, X amount of years, or, whatever you might do. Now, people look at me when I tell them to give away a home for free like I'm crazy, like I'm on drugs. And I tell a lot of people to do this, and they look at me scratching their head like I don't get how that math works. Because at the end of the day, $800 is not $500, and I'm losing all this money. Like I said, I don't think you're losing any money, and I think you're building loyalty with your tenant base. But some people don't like to do that, and I understand that. So then what they have to do is go and finance that home to the tenant, okay? And in some states, it's a real tricky spot to be in, okay? There might be all sorts of different escrows you have to worry about, and all sorts of other exposures you have to worry about when you finance the home. Plus, you definitely are going to need your license, and you're going to have to really take care of this situation, because you can't, when you give somebody a home, it's different. When you finance the home for them, all of a sudden now you're kind of the bank, and you're at a much higher level of responsibility for maintaining, certain things, especially when it comes to compliance. So what people do is they write up a note and they say, hey, this home's worth $20,000. I'm selling it to you for $20,000, or whatever the number might be, whatever you decide to sell it to them. But I'm going to let you pay it off over 7 or 10 years, and your payment's going to be this. And oftentimes it's still going to be a better number than the $800 that the tenant is currently paying. Okay, so it's going to feel still kind of like a win-win. I don't think the headache and the exposure is worth it, but some other people disagree with me on that. And so you can still get those units sold. Now, you're not necessarily going to be able to sell this to the next guy and instantly say, hey, I got this all lot rent park and I want a premium for it. It's probably not going to work that way for a couple of years because you got to let these things season, either whether you gave the home as a gift or whether you finance them over a few years. And if you finance them over a few years, after a year or so, you can probably get a discounted value on the balance of that note that they own or that they owe you, assuming it's not too far out in left field. But a typical discount value is probably 50 to 70% of the note that the tenant owes you after they've seasoned a year or two into that thing. A bank won't give you that kind of credit, okay? At least not yet. They won't. The easiest way to get the bank to say, hey, that's a real lot runner, in my mind, is by giving the home to the tenant, waiting 2 or 3 years, showing that this tenant has performed as a lot renter, and it's basically off your books now, and they'll refinance you most of the time, assuming the lending environment stays the way it is right now, and make this much easier for you from a refinance or from a sale to the next guy, okay? Depending on what your intention on holding these parks are, if it's a long-term play or a fix and flip. And the fix and flip works really well using this park-owned home strategy I just explained to you, if you have some patience and some endurance with going through the process. Because as soon as you turn it over to the tenant, it's not always they're going to stick. You're probably going to get, out of, if you did 10 in a year, you're probably going to get 3 or so of them back. And you're going to have to redo it 1 or 2 more times before you get a permanent tenant base. But much easier than trying to keep a renter in a park-owned home, which statistically is like they'll never, live there more than a couple of years now. I had one guy live in a home that I had until I gave it to him for free for 20-something years. So, but that's kind of atypical. And I really don't recommend in today's markets doing that with your park-owned homes. The caveat for sure is if you have new homes. New homes are awesome. Okay? They're built at a higher quality than even stick-built homes nowadays. Okay, and they're very efficient homes, and they can be worth $30,000 as a base model, to $60,000-$70,000 as an upgraded model, and even up to $100,000 for like a really nice place you want your grandma living in. Now, you're obviously not going to use a GRM on that. You're obviously not going to discount that income that's in there. Those first few years of that being a park-owned home, I don't recommend capitalizing the income, but I do recommend giving near full retail value when looking at those homes. Because just because it's a park-owned home but only 3 years old does not mean that $40,000 home is now worth $10,000. It's probably still worth pretty close to $40,000 most of the time. So you have to kind of add a credit to your underwriting for the newer homes at the top. So when you have your lot rent value, okay, which is what you're capitalizing, and then you have your park-owned home value, which you're not capitalizing, and in some cases it's a GRM, or in some cases it's a blue book type of value. And then below that, if you have rent-to-own notes, which is how you financed it to the tenant, you're going to want to put a kind of a different, a discount value on those notes there to get to your total price. Now, the banks, like I keep saying, might not finance you on the total price, but they will finance you on the lot rent value. Some community banks will finance you on the whole deal, but they're going to give you a much higher interest rate. Then there's even other banks, lenders that lend on the chattel that's there, park-owned homes, and their rates, they know exactly how to bring those rates up to exactly where you don't cash flow, but you're not losing money either, and they're taking all the meat for themselves. And those are typically in that 7 to 9, maybe 10% range sometimes for just the chattel loans on there. But you can still make the numbers work, which is a very interesting aspect of these things. So a lot of information to absorb that I just gave you, and by all means, guys, I'm more than happy to help walk you through this stuff. If you're looking at a park-owned home park, I probably sell, I don't know, 4 or 5 park-owned home parks, a month where they're heavy park-owned homes. We do a lot of underwriting on that. Be more than happy to kind of walk you through the mythology and share some kind of underwriting strategies because it is complicated, and I don't recommend you just saying, oh, hey, this thing makes $100,000 a year, and the guy's telling me his expenses are only $35,000 a year, and hey, this is a 15 cap, I'm going to buy it. Don't make that mistake. If you're going to buy that park, make sure it still pencils out using the proper type of math on the lot rent basis first, and then giving it an allocation for the park-owned homes.
Glenn, that was very informative. Thanks for that. I really appreciate it. Picked up a few points as always every week. And every week when you speak, you almost convince me to want to to come and work with you or even start up my own mobile home park business. But hopefully in the future,
It's
sometime.
alluring. I mean, it's definitely something that you got to listen to because it's like it, all this all this crazy kind of money in this business that people don't, never even thought of. Like, people ever thought of manufactured housing is for where's the trailer park boys and stuff like that, and that's not what our industry is. Our industry makes more millionaires than you can imagine, but it has to be done in such a way. But we definitely have cost people millions of dollars that thought that this business was easy. And it's things like the park owned homes that really jam people up.
So, if I understand correctly, you were saying park-owned homes are more expensive, or always more expensive than the normal lot rent deals that are on the market. Is that correct?
Correct. So, an average lot rent is going to be $300 to $500 somewhere in the United States most of the time. But an average park-owned home rent for a newer home is going to be probably $800 to $1,200 a month, and maybe considerably more in other markets. So, but it's like an apartment that way. You're buying an apartment and you're paying, this much higher rent to live in an apartment, right? But it's not like an apartment because it's more like a car that depreciates every year because it literally is falling down, with this, that, and the other on these older homes. So you can't capitalize all that income, even though the rents might be much higher. And you'd be like, "Ooh, look at all the meat on the bone." It's not really a lot of meat on the bone with these park-owned homes, and you have to be very conscious of that.
And if I understand correctly, you're saying the rent is the operating rent on it is much more higher than the lot rent as well because of the fact that if all the complexities that you just described.
Yeah, the operating expenses are much higher on a park-owned home community than the operating expenses would be for a lot rent community. I just evaluated this morning a park in New York, a small park that was all park-owned homes, and they're probably operating around 65% in reality. Like when we put all our numbers into how it looks, they're probably really operating somewhere in that 60 to 65% expense ratio, which is a very high number. But in New York, you got very high taxes and stuff like that, so it makes sense. But at another park just like that, that would be in New York, that was all lot rent, would probably be somewhere around a 40 to 45% expense ratio.
And from what I understand, it comes with a lot more complexities to understand: regulatory, financials,
And the tenants are a lot different too. The person who rents a mobile home versus the person who owns a mobile home, two completely different type of people. Two completely different type of people. And you have to be very aware of that. It's a totally different animal because most of the time in previous history, if they could afford an apartment, they probably would have moved to an apartment versus renting an old beat up, mobile home. Okay. Nowadays we have really nice mobile homes, and it's changed a little bit. But for the pre-2000 stuff, I would say, understand there's a big difference between the owner of that mobile home versus the renter of that mobile home when evaluating the type of tenant mix you have.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like it's a much more better investment when somebody's looking at it, but also they have to be able to understand the complexities that comes with it.
Yeah.
And it's not something to be taken lightly from what I got, what you were saying.
No, because it can be a real pain. It can be a real pain. I mean, when I converted my park, there was about 30 park-owned homes, and it took me about a year and a half to really convert all the homes over just by giving them away. You'd think giving away a home would be the easiest thing in the world. That's not. You make a few mistakes along the way, and you have to recycle a few people, and you get a home back in worse condition, and you still got to get it brought back up to level so you can give it away again. And so there's some mechanics there involved that you have to pay attention to. So don't just look at what I said and said, "Oh, easy peasy," because it ain't. It definitely ain't easy peasy. It's definitely much harder than I'm even describing it as. And I'm hoping I'm putting enough like, "Ooh, this is hard," so you understand this. But it's probably even harder than that. But people do it all the time, and I've helped people do it 100 times, and it works when it works. And for the people that just kind of wing it, it doesn't usually work as well.
Well, I think that's a problem. Everybody, they attend a weekend course or something like that, and they think, "Oh, I could do this," and they go there and they make the mistakes. Whereas somebody like you, who's been in the industry veteran, as I would call you, who's done this many times, got the scars, got the burns, got the marks, so you know exactly what to do and what not to do when you're doing something like this.
Yeah.
And in regards to sort of the industry where it is right now with the whole COVID markets, do you see what's the ratio of lot rent availability deals on the market compared to park-owned homes?
It depends which broker you talk to. Some brokers will not touch a park-owned home community. They just won't. Okay. I'm the shoe for every foot guy, right? So I take a lot of park-owned home communities. Selling a park-owned home community is much harder than selling a lot rent community. But you get more yield for it, when you, as an investor, but there's more risk and strategy you really have to pay attention to. But as far as what's available around the market in the Southeast, kind of the lower Southeast corner of the United States, we're heavy park-owned homes out here. People live in trailers all the time, and it's like a totally normal thing. But you get out to California and Seattle and places like that. The park-owned home communities just don't exist. They just don't, for one reason or another. If they do, it's few and far between. So it's really regionally kind of how it looks. And a park-owned home community, maybe in New York, those homes, if it's a nice home, might easily be worth $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 if they're in certain markets. So you might be buying those things at a significant discount compared to the retail value, and it might make a lot more sense. But overall, I would say of the parks this year that I've traded, and I've traded about 21 parks so far this year. Of those 21, I would say about 50% of them were, had some heavier element of park-owned homes. And that was 21 parks in like 15 states, so kind of a broad spectrum of a national kind of POH look. And that's pretty typical. I would say by the time the year is done, I would say that number is probably still going to be about 50% of the parks that I sell. Anyways, are going to be pretty heavy park-owned homes.
And what advice in closing do you have for anybody who is considering going into this industry? Should they look straight off the back end at the park-owned homes as compared to the lot?
No, it depends on your strategy. So if you're trying to be like a consolidator or somebody that's scaling, it might not be the greatest opportunity for you. Okay. Because like they're more management intensive and all the things we just discussed. But if you're that one guy, like yesterday, we just closed a deal in Little Rock, Arkansas, which around the world you maybe never have heard of Little Rock, Arkansas, but Little Rock's a great little town. It's the capital of the state, and it's got really good metrics out there. It's right in like the center of the country kind of thing. And that park was really hard to sell. But at the end of the day, it's a beautiful project for the next guy. He's gonna make some real money. And on that deal, that was like a 60-something space park with only about 40-something tenants. And of those 40 tenants, there was a good park-owned home. But the market for park-owned homes in that area is very strong. And the infill, once you bring a home there, it's absorbed almost immediately. And so you're gonna, in a park like that, he's gonna bring in 15 new park-owned homes in 1 year. And then he's going to have a park-owned home type of community, but he'll be able to transition those homes into TOH in a couple of years pretty easily. And so that one guy doing that one project is going to probably do very well. Now, if he gets excited and starts buying parks all around the country, it might be harder to implement that upside because when you scale, it's a different kind of animal. When you're focusing on one project at one time and I'm doing this one thing, the upside can be magnificent. Okay, on that one project for that one guy who's not using other people's money, and there isn't a GPLP type of aspect to it where it's just a typical mom and pop. Hey, I got a couple $100,000. I want to buy a park, and I can take this. I think this park was like $1.7 million or something like that, and I can take it to $3 million in a year and a half. That's the goal for the type of buyer profile that would buy that kind of park. But if you're scaling, some guys are scaling and they're buying park-owned home communities with the idea of keeping that inventory because we know they're undervalued right now. And over time with the stockpile, they'll be able to deploy their units to other parks that they've purchased and do their infill that way. That's not a bad strategy, but you're taking on a lot. Okay. And most of the guys that we're helping scale right now are buying mostly no park-owned homes, or if there are park-owned homes, they're kind of vacant park-owned homes that they can immediately transition into a tenant-owned home. And they're, following the typical protocol of, mostly a lot rent park, so the banks will finance it and stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Glenn, and for anybody who wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to get hold of you?
On my website, it's the easiest way. You can go to EstersonMHCteam.com, and that's my brokerage side of my business where we have tons of deals available to see. Or if you're looking just for straight advisory type of things, you can go to themhpexpert.com and, you know, find on either site anybody on my team's contact information to reach out to me or them or whichever guy you want to talk to or girl, and, you know, see if, you know, how we can help you. And again, we're 100% free, guys, unless we transact with each other. You know, and buying from us is most of the time 100% free, and we're here to help. But if you just want a third party to give you a review of what you're doing to make sure you're not just, you know, blowing smoke up your own, you know, imagination, then we're here to help you, because, you know, we don't want you to buy a bad deal. We want good owners getting into this thing and paying what the market is worth for these things, but being good owners and understanding what they're buying and not having a negative experience.
Great. So I thank you for that, Glenn. It was always a pleasure to have you on the show. I look forward to doing the show next week with you. I can't believe we've done 5 episodes already out of this.
Yeah, it's like nice. It's kicking right along. Yeah,
it's come along really well. So, Glenn, I will end the show today with that. Thanks a lot for that. I appreciate it, and I look forward to having you next week on the show again.
Perfect. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, guys. Bye.